asphalt shimmered ahead, a tar-black ribbon unspooling under the merciless glare of the summer sun. Heat beat down, thick and humid, like a wet blanket thrown over the whole of creation. Inside Sarah's beat-up sport utility vehicle, the air conditioning whined a losing battle, struggling to keep the simmering humidity at bay. Sarah herself, a whirlwind of an idea and nervous energy, was in full flow, her voice a rapid-fire cadence against the drone of the engine. "It's about the forgotten arteries, you know." She gestured wildly, a half-eaten granola bar forgotten in her hand. The places the interstate bypassed, the towns left to rot, the whispers still clinging to the old highways. Forgotten Roads of America. That's what I'm calling the series. Pure gold, Ben. Pure gold. Ben, 29, going on eternally jaded, grunted, his eye glued to the viewfinder of his compact digital camera. He was perched in the passenger seat, his lanky frame folded awkwardly, perpetually encased in a cloud of cynical detachment. Pure gold, sure. Provided we don't run out of gas in some forgotten purgatory first. Or, get eaten by a family of inbred swamp folk. He panned the camera across the vista, a monotonous stretch of dense primeval forest that pressed in on either side of the narrow, cracked highway they traveled. The trees, ancient oaks and pines, leaned in, their branches interwoven like skeletal fingers, clawing at the sliver of sky above. Behind the wheel, Tom, Sarah's younger brother by 2 years, offered no comment. His knuckles were white where they gripped the steering wheel, a telltale sign of the tension that coiled beneath his calm exterior. The road, barely more than 2 lanes wide and pocked with potholes, demanded his full attention. He was a man of quiet competence, a former soldier whose steady gaze often fixed on something distant, something only he could see. The lingering echoes of old battlefields. In the back, George, the stranger they'd picked up at a gas station that looked like it had been abandoned since the Eisenhower administration, was a study in stillness. He sat hunched, a tattered, heavy canvas jacket buttoned to his chin despite the oppressive heat. His gaze was fixed on the blur of trees outside, his face an unreadable mask. He'd offered a clipped George as an introduction and hadn't uttered more than a dozen words since. A faded, ugly scar, thick and puckered like an old burn, marred his left forearm, peeking out from under the sleeve of his ancient jacket. It was not a cut, it was a bite, brutally healed. The first hiccup was subtle, easily dismissed. The global positioning system on Sarah's phone, usually a beacon of digital certainty, flickered, then froze, displaying their vehicle icon suspended inexplicably in the middle of a large blue lake that was definitely not there. Ben snorted, Bermuda Triangle of Alabama calling it now. He tried his own phone, no signal. Tom's, usually reliable, displayed a defiant SOS only. The radio, which had been playing static-laced country music, abruptly went silent, replaced by a hollow, buzzing white noise that filled the car, pressing in on them. A bead of sweat trickled down Sarah's temple. "Just a dead zone," she stated, her voice lacking its earlier conviction. "Deep in the woods it happens." But her eyes darted to the dark, impenetrable wall of trees. The air, already heavy, grew thicker, a cloying, moist blanket that felt organic, like the inside of something breathing. Then, with a final gut-wrenching shudder, the sport utility vehicle coughed, sputtered, and died. Silence descended, immediate and profound, broken only by the tick-tick-tick of the cooling engine. Tom tried the ignition, but the starter motor only groaned weakly before failing completely. "Out of gas," he said, his voice flat. He pointed to the fuel gauge, needle resting firmly on E. Thought I had more than that. They were stranded. The road stretched ahead and behind, an empty artery. The forest loomed, a vast, dark presence. It wasn't just quiet. It was a deep, resonant silence that felt like a living thing, broken only by a strange, low-frequency hum that emanated from the very earth beneath them. It was a sound that vibrated more in the chest than the ears, a thrumming bass note that was deeply unsettling. The air beyond the stifling humidity carried a distinct odor now, wet earth, rich and decaying, mixed with something sharp and metallic like old blood. "Well," Sarah said, trying for bravado, "guess we walk." She grabbed her backpack, already envisioning the dramatic opening paragraph of her eventual article. Ben, ever the pragmatist, switched on his camera and began filming, a nervous tick. Tom, after a quick inspection under the hood that yielded nothing, slung his own pack over his shoulder. George, without a word, simply opened his door and stepped out, his gaunt figure melting into the heat haze ahead of them. They walked for what felt like hours, the sun slowly dipping towards the horizon, casting long, distorted shadows that danced ahead like apparitions. The road, overgrown in places with tough, invasive weeds, was clearly disused, another forgotten artery. The silence was absolute, the low hum from the forest a constant, unsettling companion. Sarah realized she hadn't heard a single bird call, no buzzing cicadas, no rustling of small animals, just the oppressive hush. Then, as the road took a final, sweeping bend, it opened up. Not to another stretch of forest, but to a vista that took their breath away, if only for its sheer, improbable incongruity. A town. It sat nestled in a shallow valley, as if carefully placed, a picture-perfect diorama from a bygone era. White picket fences gleamed in the late afternoon sun. Neatly trimmed lawns stretched like emerald carpets, and sturdy two-story houses with perfectly painted shutters lined the wide, tree-shaded streets. No litter, no peeling paint, no broken windows. It looked like a postcard from the 1950s, a testament to an idealized America that had long since vanished. The contrast between the menacing wild forest that surrounded it and the pastoral, almost sterile cleanliness of the town was jarring, deeply disorienting. "Well, I'll be damned," Ben muttered, lowering his camera for once. Norman Rockwell meets the Twilight Zone. They started towards it, a new hope, thin and fragile, blooming in their chests. As they reached the town limits, a sign, hand-painted but pristine, read simply, "Welcome to our community." No town name, just our community. A figure emerged from one of the houses, a tall, broad-shouldered man in a crisp uniform, a sheriff. He walked towards them with an easy, confident stride, his smile wide, almost too wide, revealing teeth that were a shade too long. His eyes, though, were what truly arrested Sarah. They were a startling, piercing shade of hazel, but they didn't just look at them. They saw through them, weighed and measured, almost smelled them. "Well now, folks," the sheriff boomed, his voice a rich, baritone rumble that cut through the unnatural silence. "Looks like you're a bit off the beaten path." He extended a hand, large and calloused. "Sheriff Albright. You've had some trouble, I gather." Sarah, ever the diplomat, explained their predicament, the dead phones, the global positioning system, the vanished gasoline. Albright listened, his smile never faltering, those unsettling eyes taking in every detail. "Happens sometimes. This far out. The old road plays tricks? Don't you fret, though. We'll get you fixed up. Tanker truck comes through tomorrow morning. Plenty of room at the motel. As he led them deeper into the town, Sarah began to notice things. The perfection was unsettling. The gardens, bursting with meticulously tended flowers, were almost too vibrant. The air, while no longer carrying the putrid tang of the forest, was strangely devoid of natural sounds. Still no birds, no buzzing insects, no distant rumble of lawn mowers. Just the soft crunch of their shoes on the immaculate pavement and the sheriff's overly jovial voice. They passed residents tending their lawns, watering flowers, or simply sitting on their porches. They were all impeccably dressed, their movements fluid, almost graceful, but with an underlying tension, a coiled energy that Sarah couldn't quite place. As Sheriff Albright escorted them, the residents turned, their gazes long, assessing, and unnervingly watchful. Their eyes, like Albright's, held a depth of ancient knowing, a hunger that belied their placid expressions. They were not just seeing the visitors. They were tasting them in the air. The motel, named the Quiet Pine, stood on the edge of town, a neat, unassuming building. The proprietress, a stoic woman with iron-gray hair, met them with a curt nod, her eyes fixed somewhere over Sarah's shoulder. She moved with the same unsettling grace as the other townspeople, her movements economical, almost predatory. As she handed over the keys, Sarah noticed her subtly, almost imperceptibly sniffing the air, her nostrils flaring just a fraction. Their rooms were spotless, almost clinically so. The crisp white sheets, the polished wooden furniture, everything gleamed. But beneath the faint, clean scent of antiseptic, there was something else. Something primal and musky, an indefinable animal tang that made the hair on Sarah's arms stand up. As the proprietress closed the door, the heavy clang of a massive, old-fashioned iron bolt sliding home echoed through the small space, sealing them in. It was a sound meant not to keep intruders out, but to keep something else in. It kept them in. The Wolf's Appetite Cafe lived up to its name with a sign painted in bold, rustic letters featuring a stylized, howling wolf head. Inside, the decor was simple, functional, with sturdy wooden tables and chairs. The air was thick with the rich, savory smell of cooking meat, a scent so primal it almost made Sarah's mouth water despite the burgeoning unease that had taken root in her gut. The proprietor, a burly man with a thick beard and an equally wide, unsettling smile, greeted them from behind a polished counter. His eyes, too, held that familiar, piercing intensity, a glint of something feral lurking beneath the surface. The menu was straightforward: steaks, burgers, a few hearty sides. Tom, always practical, ordered a medium-rare steak. When it arrived, it wasn't just medium rare. It was practically still mooing. A thick, crimson pool of blood oozed from the center, staining the plate. Tom stared at it, a flicker of surprise in his usually impassive eyes. The proprietor, noticing his hesitation, leaned over the counter, his smile broadening. "That's how we like it here, son. All the strength, you see. It's in the blood." His voice was low, almost a purr, and he watched Tom with an unnerving intensity, gauging his reaction. Tom, after a moment, picked up his fork, a muscle in his jaw clenching. He began to eat, slowly, methodically. As they ate, a group of children burst out from the back of the cafe, their laughter echoing a little too loudly in the otherwise quiet room. They spilled onto the dusty street outside, engaging in a boisterous game of tag. It wasn't long before the play took on a disturbingly aggressive edge. One boy, no older than 10, tackled another with a force that was disproportionate to his size. He pinned the smaller child to the ground, a low, guttural growl escaping his throat before he playfully, but with startling realism, sank his teeth into the other boy's neck. It was a mock bite, yes, but the raw, animalistic precision of the movement, the glint in his eyes, sent a chill down Sarah's spine. What was more unsettling was that none of the adults, neither in the cafe nor on the street, batted an eye. It was just children playing. Ben, ever the documentarian, had kept his camera running, capturing the town's quaint, unsettling daily life. Later, reviewing the footage in their motel room, he frowned. "Listen to this," he said, fiddling with the settings. He played back a clip of the cafe. Beneath the clatter of plates and the proprietor's booming laugh, a low, almost subliminal hum could be heard, a series of short, vibrating growls that emanated from the nearby tables. He attributed it to microphone interference, but even as he said it, a wrinkle of unease furrowed his brow. It was too regular, too organic. Returning to the motel after dinner, the lingering twilight cast long, shifting shadows across the streets. Tom, ever cautious, had insisted they take his sport utility vehicle, hoping a quick trip might somehow jar the engine back to life. It hadn't. As he pulled into the motel parking lot, he instinctively flicked on the high beams for a moment, illuminating the street with a sudden, blinding white light. For a fleeting second, an instant that stretched into an eternity, the eyes of every resident on the street, those sitting on porches, those tending their gardens, those simply standing in the dim light, flared. A vibrant, unsettling yellow-green light, like the eyes of a predator caught in a flashlight beam, burned in the darkness. Then, just as quickly, it was gone, swallowed by the encroaching shadows. The silence that followed felt heavier, pregnant with an unasked question, an unspoken certainty. Back in the sterile, antiseptic-smelling motel room, Sarah paced, a frantic energy vibrating through her. The pieces were falling into place with a horrifying, sickening click. The smells, the raw meat, the children's play, the unsettling eyes, the unnatural silence, the predatory grace of their movements, the deep bolt on the door. It all coalesced into one stark, unbelievable word. "Werewolves," she breathed, the word tasting like ash in her mouth. Ben burst out laughing, a short, sharp bark of disbelief. "Werewolves? Sarah, come on. You're a journalist, not a B-movie screenwriter. There's a logical explanation for everything. Mass hysteria? Some kind of weird local cult with a penchant for glowing contacts?" He gestured wildly with his camera. "This is a town, not a horror film set." Tom, however, didn't laugh. He sat on the edge of the bed, his face grim, his gaze distant. His military training had instilled in him a brutal pragmatism, a readiness to confront the worst. He knew how quickly the ordinary could unravel into the unspeakable. George, meanwhile, sat in a battered armchair, staring blankly at the wall, seeing something far beyond their human comprehension. His silence was chilling. The next day, the sun beat down with the same oppressive heat, but the atmosphere in the town felt subtly different, charged with a new, unspoken tension. Sarah, determined to confirm her terrifying theory, approached a woman meticulously watering a bed of blood-red roses. "Excuse me," Sarah began, her voice carefully casual. "I was just wondering about local traditions here. It's such a unique place." The woman straightened, her movements fluid as a dancer's, a faint, almost imperceptible scent of pine and something musky emanating from her. Her smile was calm, almost beatific, and in her eyes Sarah detected not menace but a weary pride. "We are children of nature, ma'am," she said, her voice soft, resonant. "We live in harmony with it, and with our own nature." She paused, her gaze drifting towards the impenetrable wall of trees that ringed the town. "It is our strength, our burden." By the end of the day, the flimsy pretense of normalcy had shattered. Sarah, Tom, and even a visibly shaken Ben were forced to confront the impossible truth. They were in a town of werewolves. Not the snarling, monstrous beasts of legend, but something far more insidious, more unnerving. Ordinary people leading unsettlingly ordinary lives, their true nature a thin veil over their civilized facade. The gasoline for Tom's sport utility vehicle still hadn't arrived. Tanker trucks held up, Sheriff Albright had explained, his smile still too wide, his eyes still too piercing. "Rough patch of road, you know." But the rough patch of road was the one they had driven in on. It was becoming clear that leaving was not an option. Fear, cold and sharp, had begun to truly settle in their bones. But for Sarah, the journalist, the horror was tempered, dangerously, by a surge of professional exhilaration. This wasn't just a story, it was the story, the biggest scoop of her life. Ben, despite his terror, found himself fascinated, his camera perpetually running, recording every subtle detail, every unnerving glance. They had stumbled upon a commune unlike any other, a secret society hidden in the deep woods. A sensation. The terrifying realization that they were trapped was overshadowed by the intoxicating allure of the discovery. They were not just witnesses, they were participants. Sleep was a flimsy thing that night, perpetually out of reach. The motel room, once a sterile sanctuary, now felt like a paper-thin shell against a world that was rapidly unraveling. Sarah lay rigid in her bed, listening, her senses hyper-alert, every nerve screaming. Tom was a silent, watchful presence across the room, his eyes open in the gloom. Even Ben, usually quick to succumb to exhaustion, shifted restlessly, muttering under his breath. George, in his armchair, was utterly still, but Sarah could feel the tension emanating from him like a palpable heat. It started subtly, a low, vibrating hum from the forest, deeper and more insistent than the one they had felt on the road. It grew, slowly, inexorably, into a profound, resonating roar that emanated from the very core of the earth. The sound pressed in on the motel, rattling the window panes in their frames, making the floorboards hum beneath their feet. It was a primeval sound, a noise that spoke of vast, unrestrained power and ancient, unfathomable hunger. Then came the thuds. Deep, heavy impacts that shook the very foundation of the building. Each thud resonated through the ground, a powerful rhythmic beat that was the movement of something monstrously large out there, something immense and unstoppable. They were not footsteps, not exactly, but something far heavier, far more deliberate. The worst sound followed, a sudden piercing crack that made Sarah gasp, a choked sound lost in the growing cacophony. It was the sound of something breaking, something large and resistant. Then came a wet, tearing rip like fabric, but infinitely more grotesque, the sound of flesh giving way, of sinews snapping. And then abruptly, a profound, dead silence. Not the previous oppressive hush, but a vacuum, a terrifying absence of sound that sucked the very air from the room. No one in the town was sleeping. As the sounds from the forest had escalated, Sarah, drawn by an irresistible dread, had crept to her window. The town was plunged into darkness, every house unlit, every porch light extinguished. Yet she could discern faint silhouettes in the windows of the houses across the street. Figures stood motionless, gazing towards the ominous black wall of the forest. They weren't hiding in fear. They were listening. They were part of some grim, nightly communion, a silent roll call against the terror that lurked beyond their carefully manicured lawns. Morning arrived, gray and heavy, the sun still a reluctant presence behind a blanket of thick, low clouds. The air was cold, the humidity replaced by a damp, chilling mist. The low hum from the forest was gone, but the memory of the night's horror clung to the air like a shroud. Sarah, unable to contain her need for answers, confronted Sheriff Albright. He stood on his porch, polishing his badge, his uniform still pristine. "Sheriff," she began, her voice trembling despite her best efforts, "we heard things last night, from the forest. What was that?" His face, usually stretched into that unsettlingly wide smile, hardened. The smile vanished, replaced by a mask of stern indifference. "Wild animals, ma'am," he stated, his voice devoid of its usual joviality. "The woods are vast. Plenty of critters out there." But his eyes, those piercing hazel eyes, darted to the forest's edge for a fraction of a second, betraying the lie. They held a fleeting glint of something akin to fear and a deep, weary resignation. Other townspeople, when asked, offered curt, evasive answers or repeated a variation of the same phrase, delivered in a flat, almost rehearsed monotone. "That's not ours. That's something else." As Sarah walked through the town later that morning, her eyes, now attuned to the subtle aberrations, caught details she had missed before. On the rough-hewn wooden walls of the houses that bordered the forest, deep, ragged gouges marred the surface. They were claw marks, undeniably, but too wide, too long, too deep to belong to any bear she knew. Some stretched nearly 7 feet high, reaching impossible distances. Even the sturdy street lamp poles, made of thick treated timber, bore similar scores. Something enormous and powerful had used them to sharpen its claws or climb them. Tom, using his finely honed military instincts, had been exploring the perimeter of the town. He returned an hour later, his face grim, carrying a small, crude plaster cast. "Found this," he said, placing it carefully on the motel room table. It was the impression of a paw print, huge and distinct, pressed into the muddy earth at the forest's edge. It was unlike anything Sarah had ever seen. The toes were too numerous, some of the joints were extra, and the arrangement of the pads was strangely asymmetrical, twisted, revealing a grotesque, unnatural anatomy. This was no ordinary animal. This was something else entirely. With the approach of dusk, the town underwent another subtle but chilling transformation. The quiet, idyllic facade began to crack, revealing the raw, tense preparations for the coming night. Children who had been playing in the streets just moments before were swiftly and silently ushered into their homes. Doors closed, lights remained unlit. Men, no longer in their work clothes, emerged onto their porches, not with pipes or books, but with heavy-gauge hunting rifles, their barrels gleaming ominously in the fading light. Others carried crudely fashioned spears, their tips glinting with a distinctive silvery sheen. They moved with a grim purpose, their faces set, their eyes fixed on the deepening shadows of the forest. They weren't preparing for a hunt. They were preparing for a siege. George, meanwhile, grew increasingly agitated. He paced their cramped motel room like a caged animal, his eyes darting to the window, perpetually fixed on the tree line. His hands trembled, a fine tremor that belied his usual stillness. Ben found him late that night, standing by the window, his face pressed against the glass, muttering, a low, choked whisper. "It smells it. It always smells the new blood." His words hung in the air, heavy with a terrible dawning implication. The unsettling knowledge they carried pressed down on them, heavier with each passing hour. Sarah, driven by a gnawing hunger for understanding, sought answers in the most obvious yet overlooked place: the town hall. It was a grand brick edifice in the center of the town, looking like something out of a faded historical photograph. Inside, she found a small, dusty library, its shelves lined with old leather-bound tomes. What struck her first was the complete absence of any books published after the 1960s. No computers, no internet, no modern media. This town was a living anachronism. Among the antique books, she found a collection of handwritten journals, their pages brittle with age. These weren't public records, but personal accounts meticulously kept, detailing the town's history, its triumphs and its struggles. They spoke of the changing seasons, the harvests, the births and deaths. But then, interspersed among the mundane entries, she found the chilling phrases, repeated with a chilling regularity. The night of the great hunt, the blood tribute, and most terrifyingly, those who walk between the trees. The entries describing these events were terse, grim, filled with a sense of fatalistic resignation. There was no explanation, only the chilling acknowledgement of their occurrence. Meanwhile, Ben, desperate to gain some perspective, to see beyond the immediate, launched his compact drone. He guided it carefully over the town, hoping to get an aerial view, to find some hidden road, some escape route. The drone buzzed upwards, a tiny mechanical bee against the vast sky. As it reached the perceived boundary of the forest, the point where the trees began to grow impossibly tall and thick, the signal from Ben's controller abruptly died. The camera, however, sent one final garbled image to his screen, a blurred dark silhouette, moving with impossible speed, racing upwards, closing in on the drone. Then silence. The drone simply fell, swallowed by the canopy, its metallic body undoubtedly crushed amidst the ancient, unforgiving branches. Ben stared at the screen, his face pale, his earlier cynicism replaced by a stark, naked fear. Tom, ever the soldier, had sought out the elderly resident named Silas, the one whose eyes held a deep, ancient sadness. Silas was out tending his garden, his movements slow but deliberate. Tom, sensing a kindred spirit in the man who knew the true face of fear, struck up a conversation. He spoke not of theories or journalistic ambition, but of the palpable dread, the feeling of being hunted, trapped. Silas listened, his gaze fixed on the impenetrable forest line. Finally, he spoke, his voice raspy, a low murmur that carried the weight of centuries. "We are not here because we want to be," Silas said, his eyes meeting Tom's, a spark of understanding passing between them. "We are here because we must be. This forest, it has its shepherds, ancient, hungry things that tend their flock, and we are the fence." He gestured with a gnarled hand towards the town, then to the woods. A living barrier. They feed on what comes through, what strays, and sometimes they feed on us. Silas's words were delivered not with anger, but with a profound, bone-deep weariness, the resignation of a man who had long accepted his grim fate. Back in their motel room, the four of them converged, sharing their fragmented, terrifying discoveries. The initial, tantalizing theory of a unique, eccentric werewolf commune shattered, replaced by a much darker, far more terrifying truth. The townspeople were not predators. They were guardians, and simultaneously, they were victims. This idyllic, picture-perfect town was not their sanctuary, but their prison. It was a post, a bulwark against something infinitely more ancient, more monstrous, that lurked in the abyssal heart of the forest. Tension in the group, already stretched taut, began to fray. Ben, reeling from the loss of his drone and the crushing reality of their situation, descended into a spiraling despair, his usual cynicism replaced by raw panic. He paced the room, muttering about being trapped, about the absurdity of it all. Tom, ever the man of action, felt the familiar urge to do something, to find a way out, to fight. But for the first time in his life, he found himself without a clear objective, without a strategy. Sarah, despite the ice forming in her own veins, tried to maintain a semblance of control, her journalist's mind frantically trying to piece together the entire horrifying mosaic. Only George remained outwardly calm, though his eyes, fixed on the distant forest, gleamed with a feverish, unnatural light, for he knew something they didn't, or was already becoming something new. As evening descended, casting long purple shadows over the town, they witnessed a new ritual. The townspeople, men, women, and even the older children, began to gather in the central square. They didn't speak. Instead, they lit dozens of lanterns, not with ordinary flames, but with a strange, dull silver light that absorbed the surrounding gloom rather than dispel it. Then, in a low, guttural murmur that swelled into a haunting, ancient song, they began to sing. It was a chant, a lament, a melody that was more animalistic than human, rising slowly into a unified, mournful howl. It was not a prayer. It was a warning. A desperate, primal cry into the encroaching darkness. The second night arrived, colder, darker, pregnant with a palpable sense of menace. The sounds from the forest were no longer distant. They were closer, intimately so, right on the periphery of the town. The low, vibrating roar was back, accompanied by the ground-shaking thuds. But now, a new, utterly vile sound joined the symphony of dread. A wet, sucking, clicking noise, like gigantic jaws opening and closing, grinding on something immensely hard, bone-crushingly powerful. The sound moved slowly, deliberately, along the perimeter of the town, testing its defenses, sniffing for weakness. It was a sound that promised not a quick death, but a slow, agonizing obliteration. The air itself cracked with an unseen energy. A collective breath held. Then, with a suddenness that made them all jump, the lights across the entire town flickered and died. Absolute darkness descended, swallowing the comforting glow of the motel room's single lamp, plunging them into a thick, suffocating blackness. Before the shock could fully register, a single mournful toll echoed through the night air. The old church bell, its iron voice cracking, struck 3 times. A signal, an ancient summons. From their window pressed close against the glass, Sarah, Tom, and Ben watched in frozen horror. In the faint shifting light of the moon, now peeking intermittently through the clouds, they saw it. The silhouettes of the townspeople standing by their own darkened windows began to twist and contort. bodies grew, shoulders broadened, limbs elongated, postures bent. The transformation was not the slow, agonizing process of a creature of myth, but a swift, almost perfunctory shift, a terrifyingly mundane metamorphosis. Their human forms melted into something larger, more powerful, more animalistic. It was horrific, yes, but also utterly routine. This was merely a nightly chore. A heavy, resounding knock shattered the silence in their room. Their door shuddered under the impact. A voice, no longer the jovial boom of Sheriff Albright, but a guttural growl, resonated through the wood. "Open up." Tom, ever the protector, moved towards the door, but Sarah grabbed his arm, her fingers like iron claws. "No," she whispered, her voice barely audible. The door burst open with a splintering crash. Sheriff Albright stood framed in the doorway, but he was no longer fully human. His face was stretched, distorted, his jawline unnaturally elongated, his teeth gleaming like ivory daggers. His eyes, already unsettling, now burned with an incandescent yellow-green light, ancient and terrifying. Fur, coarse and dark, sprouted from his neck and hands, his fingers ending in blunt, powerful claws. He was halfway there, caught between two worlds. His voice was a strained snarl, barely human. "Stay inside. Do not approach the windows. It has come for its tribute, and it smells you. Your scent, pure and untainted, drives it mad." With a final, warning growl, he turned, his powerful form already shifting, and disappeared into the chaos erupting outside. From the street, the sounds were deafening now. A chorus of furious growls, sharp yelps of pain, the sickening thud of bodies hitting pavement, the rending of wood and stone. Unable to resist, compelled by a primal need to understand, Sarah pried open a sliver of the heavy curtain. Tom and Ben pressed in beside her, their breath catching in their throats. The street was a swirling tableau of violence and shadow. Great, shaggy forms, larger than any wolf, moved with a terrifying speed and coordination. The townspeople, fully transformed, were enormous, powerful creatures, their fur matted with sweat and rain, their teeth gleaming. They fought with a savage, desperate ferocity, a cohesive pack, united against a common enemy. And then, from the profound darkness of the forest, it emerged. It was unlike anything they could have imagined, worse than any nightmare. A creature of impossible proportions and sickening anatomy. It stood easily the height of a grizzly bear, but it was gaunt, emaciated, its frame covered in sparse, patchy black fur that clung to protruding bones. Its skin, where visible, was the color of old bruises. Its front limbs were disproportionately long, ending in monstrous, sickle-shaped claws that glinted wickedly in the faint moonlight. Its head was a nightmare of elongated jaws, not a snout like the werewolves, but a stretched, reptilian-like muzzle bristling with needle-thin teeth that clicked and chattered with a dry, bone-on-bone sound. But the most horrifying detail was its face. It had no discernible eyes, no sockets, no empty pits. Just smooth, dark bone where eyes should have been. It moved with an unnatural, jerky speed, a puppet on invisible strings, its head twitching constantly, orienting itself not by sight but by sound, and, they now realized, by smell. The werewolves attacked, a coordinated assault, snapping and tearing at its flanks. But the creature was oblivious to their attacks, shrugging them off with horrifying ease. It simply swatted them aside like puppies, sending them flying with sickening thuds against the houses. Each blow of its massive, clawed forelimbs resulted in a sickening crack. the undeniable sound of bones shattering. This was no equal fight, no battle of wills. This was a brutal, one-sided beating. Suddenly, the creature lunged. It moved with a blur of speed, impossibly fast for its size, snatching one of the werewolves from the melee. Sarah recognized him, even in his transformed state, by a distinctive patch of white fur around his muzzle. It was old Silas. He had spoken with Tom, had shared the truth. And now, before their horrified eyes, the creature simply tore him apart. There was no struggle, no prolonged fight. Silas let out a single guttural shriek of pain, instantly swallowed by the sickening crunch of breaking bones, the wet rip of flesh. The creature, with a horrific casual ease, dismembered him, a flurry of black claws and snapping jaws. Having completed its grotesque task, the creature paused. It stood motionless for a moment, a dark, skeletal monument to terror, confirming the completion of its assignment. Then, with a chilling deliberation, it bent down, its needle teeth delicately picking up a piece of what remained of Silas's body. Slowly, without a single backward glance, without a sound, it turned and melted back into the inky blackness of the forest, disappearing as suddenly as it had appeared. In its wake, an absolute profound silence descended upon the town. Not the earlier, unsettling hush, but a silence that tasted of grief and raw horror. It was broken only by the mournful, sorrowful howls of the surviving werewolves, a keening lament that tore at the fabric of the night, a collective cry for their fallen brother. The sound was not of triumph or anger, but of deep, inconsolable sorrow. Dawn broke, a pale, anemic light struggling to penetrate the heavy overcast sky. The air was still, thick with the scent of pine, damp earth, and something else, a coppery, metallic tang that clung to everything, even the inside of their lungs. Yet as the sun climbed higher, casting a faint, watery glow, the town presented a facade of grim normalcy. The shattered debris was gone. The blood that had stained the cobblestone streets had been washed away by unseen hands. The broken benches and fences had been repaired, their remnants discreetly removed. The night's horrific ballet of death was erased from the physical landscape. But the pretense was thin, easily pierced. An air of profound grief hung heavy over the community, a palpable sorrow that clung to every house, every face. The residents moved through their morning routines with a quiet solemnity, their faces drawn and gray, their eyes haunted. Women stood on their porches, silently weeping into their aprons. An hour later, a soft knock came at their door. It was the mayor, an elderly werewolf named Elias, still in his human form, though his eyes too held that ancient, weary sadness. He invited them to his home, a sturdy two-story house with a carefully tended rose garden, its petals still glistening with morning dew. Inside, the atmosphere was hushed, somber. He offered them coffee, his hands trembling slightly as he poured it. "You saw it," Elias said, his voice a low rumble, devoid of any pretense or artifice. He looked at each of them in turn, his gaze unwavering. "You saw the hunger of the forest," he explained, his words painting a chilling picture of an ancient world. These creatures, which the townspeople called the elders or the hunger of the forest, were the primordial inhabitants of this land. Ancient, incomprehensible predators, beings that existed on a plane beyond human understanding. Centuries ago, their ancestors, a nomadic tribe of shapeshifters, had stumbled upon this desolate, forested region. They had encountered the elders, and a grim covenant had been forged. The werewolves were permitted to settle here, on the very border of the creature's vast hunting grounds, to serve a purpose, to be a buffer, a living shield that prevented the terrifying beasts from spilling out into the more densely populated human world. Their scent, the unique aroma of half-human, half-beast, served as a powerful deterrent, drawing the elders away from other, more easily accessible prey. The price of this grim contract was tribute. Every so often, the elders would descend upon the town, demanding their due. They would claim one of the townspeople, a sacrifice to maintain the delicate, terrifying balance. "We are the sacrificial lambs," Elias concluded, his voice barely a whisper, "who guard the flock." The horrifying truth, laid bare in the muted light of the mayor's living room, shattered whatever fragile hopes they had clung to. The werewolves were not their captors in the traditional sense. They were fellow prisoners, trapped in a centuries-old bargain with something far more ancient and terrifying. A sudden, desperate urge to flee, to outrun the nightmare, gripped them. They scrambled out of Elias's house, their hearts pounding in their chests, and ran towards the motel, towards Tom's sport utility vehicle. But when they reached the parking lot, their legs gave out. Where Tom's battered vehicle had been, there was only a twisted, unrecognizable pile of mangled metal. The roof was peeled back like a sardine can, the engine block ripped clean from its mounts. Deep, ragged furrows, unmistakably the work of the elders' monstrous claws, raked across what remained of the hood. The gas pump, too, was nothing but kindling, its tanks ripped open and bone dry. No cell service, no radio, no global positioning system, no car. The forest, Silas's shepherd, would claim them within an hour if they tried to walk out. They were utterly, irrevocably cut off. The stark, unyielding reality of their predicament broke them. Ben, his face slick with sweat and tears, slumped to the ground, dissolving into a raw, ragged hysteria. His camera, his shield against reality, lay forgotten beside him. Tom, the pragmatist, the soldier, felt a cold dread seep into his very bones. His mind, usually sharp and strategic, raced, searching for a plan, a way out, but found nothing but an echoing void. Sarah, whose ambition and curiosity had led them down this terrifying path, fought to maintain her composure, but inside, a glacial terror was taking root, spreading through her veins. Only George, sitting on the ground beside the twisted wreckage of the sport utility vehicle, remained outwardly calm. He was not crying, not screaming. He was simply laughing. A low, dry chuckle that held no humor, only a chilling, desolate amusement. The next morning was not a morning of hope, but one of grim, stark reality. The ruined car sat as a monument to their entrapment, a twisted metal sculpture of lost possibilities. Sheriff Albright, back in his crisp uniform, though his eyes still held a lingering feral glint from the night before, approached them. His usual overly wide smile was absent, replaced by a stern, almost pitying expression. "You're part of this now," he stated, his voice devoid of its earlier warmth, a blunt pronouncement of an inescapable truth. "The forest has marked you. When the elder tasted Silas's blood, it smelled your scent. You were here. You saw. Now your human spirit. It's a beacon in the darkness for it." The words hung in the humid air, heavy with their terrifying implications. They were no longer guests, nor simply prisoners. They were bait. Their pure, untainted human smell, not yet mixed with the beast blood that flowed through the townspeople, was an irresistible lure. Their presence, unmasked by the protective scent of the pack, disturbed the fragile balance that had existed for centuries. The hunger of the forest, the elders, would now come more often, and they would come specifically for them. The residents of the town, once outwardly hospitable, now avoided them. Their gazes, when they did fall upon Sarah, Tom, and Ben, held a chilling mixture of pity and raw fear. They were no longer just strangers. They were outcasts, living dead men walking, their very presence an existential threat to the delicate peace the town had painstakingly maintained. The newcomers were a magnet for the monster, a threat that could unravel everything. The nights, after that revelation, became an unbearable torment. Each sundown brought with it a renewed, heightened dread. The low, vibrating roar from the forest was no longer a distant threat. It was a constant, insistent thrum that resonated in their bones, each pulse closer than the last. They barricaded their motel room door with every piece of furniture they could move, but it felt futile. A child's game against an unstoppable force. Every rustle of leaves outside, every faint creak of the old building, sent jolts of pure terror through them. Shadows, already dancing in the periphery of their vision, took on a life of their own, coiling and uncoiling just beyond the windows. They swore they heard faint scratching sounds at the door, phantom claws seeking entry. The group, once united by a shared purpose, began to fracture under the immense, unrelenting pressure. Tom, his military discipline cracking under the sheer impossibility of their situation, turned his anger on Sarah. "This was your idea," he accused, his voice raw, hoarse. "Your big story. Look where it got us." Ben, his usual cynicism replaced by a desperate, childish petulance, lashed out at Tom, blaming his brother's stoicism for their perceived inaction. Sarah, despite the growing ice in her own heart, tried to rally them, to find some common ground, but her own unwavering confidence was rapidly eroding, dissolving into a terrifying uncertainty. Only George remained eerily calm, his silence deepening, his focus singular. He spent long hours on the outskirts of the town, his gaze fixed on the menacing black wall of the forest. He refused food, his gaunt face growing even more hollow. Sarah noticed a subtle yet alarming change in him. The old ugly scar on his forearm, the one that was a bite, had become inflamed, a livid red against his pale skin. At night he would whimper and groan in his sleep, his body twitching and jerking, seized by an unseen force. He was undergoing some internal struggle, a transformation that was both terrifying and deeply personal. Then Mayor Elias came to them again, his face etched with a profound sorrow. "There is only one way," he said, his voice quiet, heavy with ancient knowledge. "Only one way to survive in this place. Only one way to stop being a beacon, a lure. You must cease to be human. You must accept the gift of the forest. You must become one of us." Elias stood before them, a study in grim resignation. He explained the process in a low, measured tone, detailing a mundane transaction. The bite of an alpha, administered during a specific ritual, would initiate the transformation. Their scent would change, becoming part of the pack, part of the protective fence. The elders would cease to view them as individual, delectable prey, instead seeing them as part of the buffer, part of the barrier. It was the only way to survive. The proposition ripped through the already fractured group like a jagged claw. Ben, his eyes wide with terror and disgust, vehemently rejected the idea. "No," he shrieked. his voice cracking. "I'd rather die human. I'd rather die myself than turn into one of them." He backed away, pressing himself against the far wall of the motel room, trying to escape the very air in the room. Tom, the soldier, the pragmatist, found himself torn. For him, survival was the primary instinct, etched into his very being by years of combat. He wanted to live. But the cost. The thought of becoming what he now knew these people to be sent a shudder of revulsion through him. He hesitated, his face a mask of internal torment. Sarah, despite the profound horror of the idea, saw the cold, brutal logic in Elias's words. It was a choice between two unimaginable fates, and one, however monstrous, offered the slimmest chance of survival. The raw, guttural fear was still there, but beneath it, a desperate, calculating mind was at work. As the argument raged, George, who had been silent for so long, slowly began to strip off his tattered canvas jacket. The movement was deliberate, almost ceremonial. Beneath his sleeve, stark and undeniable on his forearm, was the terrible puckered scar. It wasn't a faded mark anymore. It was angry, inflamed, the skin around it red and swollen, and it was clearly, unequivocally, the mark of a bite, a deep, ragged wound left not by an animal, but by something far more savage and powerful. He looked at them, his eyes wild, feverish. His voice, when it came, was a raspy whisper, thick with a terrible confession. "Years ago," he rasped, "my group, we got lost. Just like you. In a place like this." He paused, his gaze fixed on his arm. "I was bitten. I ran. I escaped. While my friends, they died." A tremor ran through him. "But the call of the forest, it never left me. It brought me back. I wasn't a lost traveler, not really. I was coming home." George was not a random hitchhiker. He was a man drawn back to his destiny, a half-made thing pulled back into the fold. As he spoke, a profound change began to take hold of George. A fever, hot and violent, gripped him. His pupils dilated until his eyes were twin pools of blackness. Any loud sound, any sudden movement, elicited a low, primal growl from his throat. He spoke again, his voice strained, filled with a terrible certainty. "I feel the hunt," he whispered, his body twitching with an internal struggle. "It's coming. For us." His body was already preparing, responding to an ancient internal rhythm. Outside, the townspeople knew. The smell of 4 clean humans, fresh and untainted, was not merely a lure. It was a feast, an irresistible banquet for the creatures of the forest. They were preparing not just for a battle, but for a massacre. Men and women moved with grim resolve, sharpening their silver-tipped blades, loading their rifles with cartridges packed with silver shot. Their faces were etched with a desperate, fatalistic courage. Sarah, Tom, and Ben stood paralyzed, caught between the two terrifying alternatives. Accept the bite and live, surrendering their very humanity in the process, or face certain, gruesome death as themselves. There was no more time for deliberation, no more room for debate. From the profound darkness of the forest, the low, vibrating roar began again. Not a single roar, but several, a chorus of hungry, ancient voices. The ground beneath their feet began to tremble, a deep, resonant vibration that threatened to crack the very foundations of the motel. The tops of the ancient trees, visible through the window, swayed and whipped back and forth, even though there was no discernible wind. And then, emerging from the utter blackness of the tree line, not one, but 3 distinct silhouettes materialized. They were immense, far larger and more terrifying than the lone creature they had witnessed on the night of the great hunt. The town fell utterly silent, holding its breath, waiting for the impending slaughter. The assault began not with a charge, but with a horrifying, calculated precision. The three elders, their forms indistinct shadows against the darker backdrop of the forest, attacked the town simultaneously from three different directions. The ensuing chaos was immediate and absolute. The night exploded into a symphony of terror. The booming reports of rifle fire, the guttural snarls of transformed werewolves, the high-pitched screams of the injured, and the sickening, wet crunch of bone as flesh was ripped apart. Inside the motel room, the sounds were deafening, the air thick with the metallic tang of fear and imminent death. George, whose internal struggle had been escalating for hours, suddenly crumpled to the floor, writhing in agony. His body contorted, his limbs snapping and twisting with a series of wet, sickening pops and cracks. This was no gradual, almost mundane transformation like the townspeople's. This was an agonizing, primal mutation, a violent shattering and rebuilding of bone and muscle. He thrashed on the floor, his human form rapidly dissolving into something wild and monstrous. His first, uncontrolled turning. One of the colossal elders, a creature of pure, ravenous hunger, smashed through the outer perimeter of the town's defenses, its movements a blur of impossible speed. It tore through the fragile wooden structures like paper, its destination clear. The motel, where the scent of pure human blood was strongest. It reared back, its impossibly long claws glinting in the faint moonlight, preparing to tear down the entire wall. In that heart-stopping moment, faced with certain gruesome obliteration, Tom's military instincts, his ingrained drive for survival, kicked in. He saw the mayor, Elias, in his fully transformed state, a magnificent, ancient gray wolf, powerful and scarred, fighting fiercely nearby. "Do it!" Tom screamed, his voice raw, desperate, tearing through the cacophony of battle. "Do it now." Elias, understanding the implicit plea, lunged. His powerful jaws closed around Tom's shoulder, a sharp, searing pain that sent a jolt of venom and transformative magic through Tom's veins. Tom cried out, then collapsed, his body convulsing, consciousness slipping away into a roaring darkness. Ben, witnessing the grotesque scene unfold, the impossible horror of his friend being bitten, snapped. He let out a piercing, hysterical shriek, a sound of pure, unadulterated panic. In a desperate, self-destructive flight response, he bolted from the motel room, directly into the swirling maelstrom of the battle. The second elder, its non-existent eyes sensing Ben's terror, his frantic, pure human scent instantly diverted its attention from the defending werewolves. It turned, a towering shadow of bone and muscle, and moved towards him with impossible speed. Ben, in his final desperate act, managed only to raise his camera, a useless shield, towards the oncoming horror. His scream was cut short, abruptly, brutally. The third elder, relentless and unstoppable, breached the motel from above, its immense form crashing through the roof with a splintering roar of wood and plaster. Sarah, now utterly alone, stood frozen in the rapidly deteriorating room. But just as the creature's shadow fell upon her, a new feral roar erupted from the floor. George, newly transformed, his body still shifting, a grotesque hybrid of man and beast, launched himself at the elder with a primal fury. He was smaller, weaker, less experienced, but a raw, unyielding rage burned in his feral eyes, a desperate defense of the last remaining human. His attack was a selfless, suicidal diversion, but it bought Sarah precious, life-saving seconds. Sheriff Albright, his fur matted with blood, one leg clearly broken and twisted at an unnatural angle, dragged himself towards Sarah. His human form was barely holding, his wolf's face contorted in pain and fierce resolve. He grabbed her arm, his grip surprisingly strong, and pulled her towards a gaping hole in the back wall where the elder had torn through. "Decide, girl," he rasped, his voice a low growl. "The forest has already chosen for you." The battle raged on, a blur of teeth and claws and silver. Then, as the first pale slivers of dawn pierced the eastern sky, the elders, responding to an unseen signal, abruptly disengaged. They retreated, slipping back into the deep woods as silently as they had appeared, carrying with them the mangled bodies of their fallen prey, the grisly payment for their nocturnal feast. The town, in the pale, cold light of morning, was a scene of devastation. Houses were shattered, fences flattened, the street still stained with drying blood. Several of the brave werewolf defenders lay dead, their forms slowly reverting to human, their faces frozen in expressions of agony. Ben was gone, nothing left but a smear on the ground. Tom lay unconscious in the ruined motel room, his body burning with a fierce, unnatural fever, the bite mark on his shoulder already swelling, blackening. He was alive, but irrevocably changed. George, his form half human, half wolf, lay nearby, bleeding and broken but breathing. Of the four, only Sarah remained unchanged, her human form a stark, vulnerable beacon in the aftermath of the crimson night. The first rays of sunlight, weak and watery, painted the ruined town in a palette of somber grays and reds. Sarah walked through the debris-strewn streets like an apparition, her senses numb with shock and a profound, bone-deep weariness. The residents, their faces grim and silent, were already at work, meticulously cleaning, rebuilding, covering the stark evidence of the night's carnage. They moved with a practiced, almost mechanical efficiency, their grief a silent, palpable presence. They looked at Sarah not with hatred nor with fear, but with a deep, unsettling pity. She was the anomaly, the last pure one, a living, breathing siren for the hunger of the forest. The next time, they all knew, it would come solely for her. She found Tom in the ruins of the motel room, lying amidst the splintered wood and torn drywall. His body was hot to the touch, racked with a violent, uncontrollable fever. He thrashed and mumbled, a low, guttural growl escaping his throat. His skin was pale, clammy, and beneath it, Sarah could see the subtle but unmistakable shifting of muscle and bone. The bite had done its work. He was no longer entirely her brother. He was becoming part of the town, part of the fence. George, miraculously, was stirring. He was still in his half-transformed state, his features an unsettling blend of human and canine, his body a map of fresh wounds and matted fur. But his eyes, though still holding a feral gleam, were clear, focused. He looked different, stronger, more grounded. He approached Sarah, his movements fluid, predator-like. "Now I'm home," he rasped, his voice still hoarse, but with a new, resonant depth. "And you're not. But soon you will be." There was no threat in his words, no malice, only the chilling, undeniable truth of a fact. He was home, she was not. Yet. Mayor Elias, his own wounds bandaged, his face etched with a profound sorrow that deepened with each passing hour, found Sarah amidst the desolation. His voice was quiet, regretful. He spoke not of escape, but of destiny. Her fate, he explained, was sealed. The forest would not release her now, and the townspeople could not allow it. Her continued presence, her pure human scent, was a direct mortal threat to their already precarious existence. The elders would return. They would return tomorrow night, and they would come for her. The realization, stark and unyielding, finally broke Sarah. Her ambition, her dreams of the big story, her entire past life, it all crumbled into ash around her. There was no sensation to be had, no escape to be planned, only a cage. And in this cage, the predators outside were infinitely more terrifying than the silent, grim jailers within. She looked at her brother, his breath coming in ragged, growling gasps, his body slowly, inexorably twisting into something else. She looked at the weary, determined faces of the townspeople, who, despite their own fears, despite her status as a beacon of doom, had still fought to protect them. She understood then. There was only one way left, one way to save Tom, one way to save herself. She found Elias, standing beside the remnants of the church bell tower, his head bowed. Her voice was firm, resolute, though hot, silent tears streamed down her cheeks. "I'm ready," she said, the words tasting of salt and ash. This was no savage bite delivered in the heat of battle, no desperate act of expediency. This was a ritual, ancient and solemn, steeped in centuries of grim tradition. Sarah was led to the center of the town square, to an ancient, weathered stone altar that was carved from the very heart of the earth. The townspeople gathered around, their faces solemn, their expressions a mixture of sorrow and a quiet, terrible pride. They lit their silver lanterns, their dull glow casting long, shifting shadows that danced around the sacred space. Elias, in his human form, but with the aura of an ancient, powerful being, stood before her. He spoke in a low, resonant voice, his words echoing in the hushed night. "Each one who passes through this becomes not merely a werewolf," he explained, his eyes fixed on Sarah's, but a guardian, a part of the wall. "Your human memories, yourself, they will remain, but they will blend, intertwine with the instincts of the beast. You will see, you will hear, you will smell as you never have before, you will protect." In that final, agonizing moment, a wave of raw panic, cold and paralyzing, washed over Sarah. Her past life, her dreams of success, the vibrant, chaotic world she had known, it all flashed before her eyes. She looked down at her hands, slender and capable, and knew that soon they would transform, become powerful, clawed paws. The urge to flee, to scream, to reject this monstrous fate was overwhelming. But there was nowhere to run. The forest was an impossibility, the town a prison. There was no escape. Then a familiar figure approached. Tom. He was no longer feverish, no longer delirious. His body, though still in a state of subtle flux, had stabilized. His eyes were different, a piercing yellow-green, but in their depths, she still saw her brother, the familiar flicker of his spirit. He moved with a new grace, a coiled power, but he was undeniably Tom. He said nothing, simply reached out. His hand, larger, slightly clawed, but still his, took hers. His touch was firm, reassuring. It was a silent promise that she would not be alone. And in that moment, in his quiet strength, Sarah found her own. Elias, with a deep, mournful sigh, began his transformation. His human features elongated, fur sprouted, muscles rippled, bones shifted with a sickening swiftness. In seconds he stood before her, a magnificent, towering gray wolf, his eyes ancient and wise. He did not attack. He lowered his massive head, his muzzle brushing against her shoulder, and then, with an almost agonizing tenderness, he bit her. The sharp, searing pain exploded through her, a white-hot agony that permeated every cell, every nerve ending. Venom, magic, ancient power. It flooded her bloodstream, burning away the last vestiges of her purely human self. She gasped, stifling a scream, her body trembling violently, but she endured. The world for Sarah exploded in a kaleidoscope of pain and sensation. She crumpled to the ancient stone, her body racked with an unimaginable torment. Her bones screamed as they fractured and knitted anew. Muscles tore and reformed. Her skin stretched and grew coarse fur. Memories, vivid and visceral, flashed before her eyes. Childhood laughter, the smell of printer's ink, the thrill of the chase for a story, all mixing, merging, transforming into new, alien instincts. The scent of blood, the profound, resonant feeling of a pack, the distant primal roar of the forest, it all became part of her, a new, terrifying reality. The agony, as suddenly as it had come, receded. A profound exhaustion washed over her, followed by a startling, exhilarating clarity. She pushed herself up, her limbs feeling strangely powerful, unfamiliar. The world had changed. The darkness that had enveloped the town was no longer a void. She could see, discern shapes and movement with an impossible precision. She could hear the rapid, rhythmic beat of every heart around her, the rustle of leaves miles away. And she could smell them. The fear of the few remaining clean humans, and the comforting, familiar scent of her new kin. Her pack. She was home. Weeks bled into months, each one marked by the slow, inexorable process of adaptation. Sarah, Tom, and George learned to navigate their new reality, a life intertwined with the ancient rhythms of the town and the primal call of the forest. They learned to control the transformations, to shift between human and wolf with a growing ease, though the process still left them aching and hungry. They hunted, not for sport, but for sustenance, their senses honed to an impossible keenness. They were part of the pack now, their individual human spirits woven into the vast, protective tapestry of the community. Their humanity hadn't vanished. It had merely been reshaped, deepened, becoming part of something larger, something ancient and powerful. Then came the night when they first stood on the perimeter, not as observers, but as defenders. The air crackled with the familiar dread of the approaching elders, the low, vibrating roar of the forest a palpable presence. Sarah stood shoulder to shoulder with Tom, her human form still, but her senses alive, her inner wolf snarling in anticipation. She saw the shadow of the elder approaching from the trees, immense and terrifying. But this time, the paralyzing terror was absent. In its place, a fierce, protective rage burned in her chest, a primal instinct to guard her home, her kin, her new life. One afternoon, rummaging through the ruins of the old motel, Sarah stumbled upon Ben's camera, miraculously intact amongst the debris. The memory card was still inside. She played back the last few seconds of footage, a blurred, distorted image of the onrushing horror. Ben's final choked scream abruptly cut short. She didn't delete it. It was a reminder, stark and brutal, of who they had been, and of the terrible, unimaginable price they had paid for their new existence. Later that day, Sarah and Tom sat on the porch of their new house, a small, sturdy home with a freshly painted white picket fence, built quickly by the collective efforts of the town. The sun was warm on their faces. "Do you miss it?" Sarah asked, her voice soft, contemplative, referring to their old life. the world they had left behind. Tom was silent for a long moment, staring out at the vibrant, impossibly green lawns. Every day, he admitted, his voice a low rumble. But here, for the first time in a long time, I feel like I have a purpose. I protect. His gaze drifted towards the impenetrable wall of trees that ringed their community, a protective challenge in his newly keen eyes. The afternoon quiet was abruptly broken by the distant, incongruous sound of a motor, a car engine, sputtering and hesitant, growing slowly louder. Down the same winding, overgrown road they had traveled months ago, a dusty, unfamiliar sedan crawled into view. It was a newer model, bright and out of place against the faded Americana. A young couple sat inside, their faces confused, slightly panicked, clearly lost. The circle was complete. Sheriff Albright, his broad shoulders squared, his uniform crisp, stepped out to greet them, his signature wide, unnaturally cheerful smile firmly in place. Sarah, Tom, and George stood on their porch, watching the new arrivals with a profound, unsettling understanding. They saw the confusion, the fear, the burgeoning curiosity in the tourists' eyes, the same emotions that had once been their own. Sarah felt a subtle shift in her muscles, a tremor of primal power beneath her skin, ready for the change. She gripped her brother's hand, a silent acknowledgement of their shared fate. We found a small town in the southern states where all the residents were werewolves. That was terrifying. But the true terror, the one that settled deep in our bones, was that now we were part of it too. This was our home. This was our destiny.